Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. It seems like each and every hour there's a different official, unofficial policy coming from this Trump administration towards Russia. One day he's saying Putin is his best friend. The next day he's saying that he's crazy and he's insane and he's killing so many people. So I don't know what to make of it. I'm hoping my guest has a better understanding and maybe insight into what's going on because he's an expert in this field. Joining me today is Steve Jeremy. He is a retired Royal Navy Commodore, and he commanded warships in the 5th Destroyer. This is an incredible biography, I was just saying. He served in the Falklands War and the Adriatic for the Bosnian and Kosovo campaigns and retired after an operational tour. In 2007, as strategic director in the British Embassy in Afghanistan. He is the author of Strategy for Action Using Force Wisely in the 21st Century and now works in offshore energy. So, Mr. Jeremy, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm doing fine, Jackson. We're watching with interest how this Russia-Ukraine campaign plays out. I'm afraid that here in the UK, I'm one of a few voices in the wilderness who take a different view to the conventional mainstream media, I should say. Although I do it not on any ideological view, but much more to do with how I read the war strategically.
In your circle of friends, I'm curious if you have veterans and past colleagues and brothers that you served with who share this opinion that you have, or is it primarily people that are looking through this crisis through a moral lens right now?
That's a very good question. I think that amongst my friends and colleagues, Jackson, I'd say about 80% still take the view of the mainstream media. But there's about 20% who actually can starting to see it. I think that I did an article recently on the balance of power and how that overwhelmingly favors Russia. And people who start to see that can understand it, because you can have the conversation on a moral level, and I have quite strong views about the morality of it. But even if the West was on the right, and I don't think we are, but even if we were on the right, then if we haven't got the power to actually impose our will on Russia, then it doesn't really matter. So when you look at the balance of power, we don't. Ukraine, I think, is relatively weak. NATO, I did in the previous article, is weak, notwithstanding what you hear from what people say. And things aren't terrific in the States as well. The fundamental foundations for military power are industrial capacity and energy. And you're better off than we are here in Europe. But we know there's an issue with industrial capacity because that's why America's trying to reindustrialize. So it's for those reasons that Russia is out producing the whole of the West in 155 ammunition. Despite the fact that we're supposed in NATO to be the greatest alliance in history, which is simply untrue.
What do you think about these rumors? And as far as I know, that's all they are right now, but rumors that Trump is going to, or he's thinking about lifting all restrictions from the Biden era on weapon supplies to Ukraine. Would something like that, a move like that, excluding the possibility of nuclear weapons, would that have some sort of a sea change impact for the Ukrainian efforts against Russia?
I think there's two parts to that question, really, because nuclear is apocalyptic. And I'd like to think that that's something that nobody with any sense.
Yes, excluding the nuclear.
Yeah, so excluding nuclear. On the other things, I don't think it would make a difference on the ground. When you look at the campaign, people always say Russia isn't going very quickly. But what they're doing is guessing what Russia's strategy is, and they're missing what Russia's primary objectives are. And Russia's primary objectives are to secure the Donbass which they've largely speaking achieved, and to achieve demilitarization and denazification. I mean, we know this because they keep telling us, they've been telling us for 3 years now. And demilitarization, essentially, they're achieving through destroying the Ukrainian army. And the figures that I find most persuasive are those of people like Colonel Doug McGregor, who is now talking about 1.4 million killed in action of the Ukrainian army. I mean, that is catastrophic. And it's a very sad thing to say, but if you want to destroy the military capability of Ukraine, then there's little better way to do it than to take away the fighting people of the country. It's very difficult to see how Ukraine can keep going as its manpower is slowly attrited, whilst Russia's manpower is growing. So I don't think that special weapons would make much difference. We've talked about Storm Shadow and all these long-range missiles. The only thing that those special weapons would do is that if they're used in the campaign, I think there's a evens chance that the Russians would extend outside the Ukrainian campaign if they're being attacked in Russia by long-range weapons. If I could imagine a situation, I think this is 50-50, but I could imagine a situation where Russia does respond in kind, and if they do respond in kind, then they can respond in a way which we cannot defend against. We can't defend against hypersonic missiles. One of my jobs was as a captain of an air defence destroyer, so I've got a good understanding of air defence, and I know for sure that it'll be 5 years as a minimum, I would say, even if we can, to us to get to a position where we could defend ourselves against hypersonic missiles, which the Russians have at least a 5 to 10 year lead on us, Jackson.
Well, you saw maybe President Putin came out this week and he said that he was talking about the liberation of the Kursk region, and he said something to the effect of, now that we have Kursk, we're going to create a buffer zone in the Sumy region. And there's also talk about Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. There's talk about Kharkiv again. I mean, for the past few years, all we've heard is Russia is weak. They're going to be defeated. They're going to lose. Now the media is talking about 7 different regions of Ukraine, formerly Ukraine, which might come under Russian control. I mean, should this have been expected all along that Russia had the capacity to do this? And do you think that there's any stopping it now, even if NATO were to get involved?
No, I don't think there is any stopping it. I think that in an article I did some months ago, I talked about NATO being weak. And the truth is that NATO doesn't have the land forces to compete against Russia. And the land forces that we do have are not experienced in the form of combat that we're seeing in this particular campaign. So I think the chances of NATO coming in are slim, even if there were the political will in the NATO countries, and I don't think there is. I don't think that NATO could prevail. In fact, I'm about as certain as I can be that we can't prevail. So the question is how you deal with that. I mean, one of the key issues is that can you imagine NATO countries taking the level of casualties that even Russia has taken? We're talking about 100,000 casualties. I mean, I think it's America struggled with 55,000 casualties in Vietnam. I was in Afghanistan, and over the 20 years that Britain was in Afghanistan with America, I think Britain took about 450 casualties. You'd have that sort of levels of casualties in NATO countries in a week, let alone 20 years. And I think there's no political appetite for that whatsoever. What the NATO nations seem to be wanting to do is continue the war through small uses of weapons which are strategic bombardment and will have no significant impact on the campaign. If you think back to the Second World War, Britain was bombed by the Germans with V1 and V2 rockets. And it was an irritation, but it didn't stop the campaign. And it'll be the same this time round. So what we will see, I suspect, is that if the Ukrainians aren't prepared to agree to Russian terms this time round, then they'll be worse next time round. We've seen that time and again. So at the start in March of 2022, then all that was asked of Ukraine was that Russia retain Crimea and that the Donbass be allowed self-governance. And each time that there has been a negotiation, or each time the West and Ukraine have refused those terms, the next time round they get worse. So it was 4 oblasts, and I think we're now talking about 7 oblasts, and I think we're on the way to unconditional surrender, after which Ukraine will essentially be a rump state, and much of what was Ukraine will have been taken into what's known as the new Russia, if you like. And I think it's all very well to have a moral conversation about this, but the point is that we do not have the power to impose conditions that we want to on Russia, no matter how much justice we think they might be. I happen to think they're not just, and I happen to think that the origins of the war goes back as far as 1996 and decisions to extend NATO and to support the growth of the NATO, of the Ukrainian army from 2014 onwards. But as far as I can see, even if we were in the moral right, we simply don't have the power to impose conditions on Russia. So I think we're going to have to suck it up. It's a defeat, and it's a defeat, largely speaking, Jackson, through a lack of a capacity to think strategically. And it's not as if this is our only defeat. It comes on the heels of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine. So I think it's about time the West had a good look at it itself and worked out what it is that we're doing wrong.
I agree with you, but I also think it's important to recognize, that Ukraine is a country that I think no one thought would get this far. And they got this far through, as you mentioned, just giant suicide mission, sending all these men to their death, probably over 1 million by now. And that is horrific. But the fact that Zelensky's still in power, the fact that there's not a mass, civil unrest in the country, the fact that there's still relative control, I think it's scary and it's impressive. A lot of people have said that they thought this Ukrainian military would have its all-out collapse long ago. Do you think that we're now at a point where you don't have Biden in power anymore? The EU is getting weary. Do you think we're at a point where we actually might see something like that materialize, where there is a complete collapse?
Yeah, I think it's possible. This is a really difficult one to call because some of us wondered if it might happen last year. But again, I think the danger is that what we all do, and you'll hear this time and again from military and academic commentators about Russia going slowly and them not doing very well. Again, they miss the point. Russia is doing this according to its own strategy. I've said some time ago that the West is being guided by a political narrative and the Russians are being guided by a military strategy. And when you seek to understand the strategy, it seems to me that they're operating in the way that I probably would do in their situation. They're causing a lot of attrition on the Ukrainian army, minimizing their own casualties, which you would do, and largely speaking, wearing the Ukrainian army down in what's known as attritional warfare in my old first career. And I think the problem is that there comes a time when there is going to be a culmination, so to speak, and I suspect that we're quite close to it, but it's much more difficult nowadays to make these large arrowhead drives into territory of the opponent, and there's no doubt that drones have had an effect on that. Not just the drones themselves and how they attack people, but their ability to make sure that artillery is much more accurately used. So for those reasons, I wonder whether we will see the sort of large thrusts that you would have seen during the Second World War. What I do think, though, is I think Russia will go as far as the Dnipro. I'm about as certain as I can. This is for security reasons, because for Russia, this is all about security. I suspect as well that they'll go across the Dnipro River at Kherson and secure Odessa and that part of Ukraine as well. And then the buffer zones as an open question. But again, the reason those buffer zones are in think, Jackson, is that they're seeking to get strategic depth and to prevent attacks from the rump, Ukraine, into Moscow. So I suspect that that's why they're there. So yeah, I think whether this falls to a sort of culminating point later this summer or we're into next year, I don't know. My guess is it will be the former, but it's difficult to say.
What did you make of the reported attempt to assassinate President Putin this week? He was flying to Kursk, I guess, and the Ukrainians thought that now would be a good time to try and kill him.
I don't know. I don't think we know if he was particularly targeted. I mean, these things do happen. It happened during the Second World War when Admiral Yamamoto was targeted by the Americans and successfully so. If he was targeted, the next question, it's a really important question, is whether that targeting was on the basis of simply Ukrainian intelligence or Western intelligence. And if it's the latter, that's a bad thing, I think. And the thought that actually Western intelligence might be used to promote an attack on the Russian president is a sort of form of madness, I think. And you can see why the Russians would be angry if that was the case. I think the point, though, is that people seem to assume that if Putin's gone, then actually things will get easier. And I think the likelihood is that it'll be the other way around. And there are many people in Russia who are much less calculating and much more inclined to be much more hard-nosed. And there are people in Russia, I think, who, when storm shadows and attackers were used last year into Russia, who might well have responded against Western targets. And as I say, we can't defend ourselves against hypersonic missiles. So a hypersonic missile arriving in a British airfield or a German airfield or a French airfield or an American base somewhere in the Middle East in response to the use of these weapons in Russia. And we know these weapons will have been targeted, will be targeted using Western intelligence, and probably the trigger fingers will be Westerners as well. So I think Putin has been incredibly cautious and calculating, and thank goodness he has, because we could have seen a broader escalation. So those who are talking and would like to see Putin go, I would say be careful what you wish for.
I agree with you 100%. In fact, I remember there was an interview with Lukashenko, and he said when he settled the score and offered a peace to Prigozhin, when Prigozhin was on his way to Moscow, apparently, this is what he said, the CIA and the MI6 called him and thanked him for settling the peace because they were so scared and terrified about what Prigozhin would do if he was leading things in Moscow. What do you think about this new effort, which was successful, and I'm glad it was? You had a 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner/hostage swap between Russia and Ukraine this week. All the other ceasefires and ceasefires on targeting certain things in the Black Sea, for example, or on Easter, all these things failed. But this was the first step towards peace we saw that was successful. Do you think it's going to be followed up by further steps, and are you hopeful?
I'm cautious. I mean, I think it's a good sign, and the prisoner exchanges are a good thing, although it's very interesting to see the ratio in those prisoner exchanges, because for every 7 or 8 or 10 Ukrainian prisoners, there's one Russian prisoner. So that tells you something about the campaign and the fact that the Russians are doing well. I think the critical problem really in the ceasefire and the negotiations is that there is a divergence of thinking between the West on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. The West seem to think that we should go for a ceasefire and then negotiate, whereas the Russians have been clear for years, literally for years, that what we need to do is to negotiate so that they can get to what they see as the fundamental foundational causes of the war, and then the ceasefire happens. And who can blame them? They're winning at the moment and winning significantly. So all that a ceasefire would do in their minds, and I think they're probably right in this, is give the Ukrainians 30 days or so to regroup and to to sort of take stock and get logistics back in, ammunition on, and so on. So why would they want to do that? I mean, in their position, I wouldn't do it. So I think actually, as soon as we can start to understand that if we can get into a negotiation, and I find it difficult to think that we will, because I can't see the Western leaders accepting it. But if we had any sense, we would. We can get into, accept that Russia wants to get into negotiation so that we can have a long-term, stable Europe after the end of the war, then that'd be a good thing. But it really requires a really big change of heart to the Western leaders, because at the moment the Western leaders are driving towards what could have been a bad defeat and will actually be, I think, a worse defeat. And it won't just be a defeat for Ukraine. It'll be a defeat for NATO, and it'll be a defeat for the EU as well as all the nations that are in those. So I think that the problem is that we're in a good money after bad, I'm afraid, Jackson. And I can see little prospect at the moment of what could be bad conditions turning into anything other than worse conditions if we keep trying to fight the Russians and stop accepting or not accept that the situation is one of defeat. Let's not beat around the bush. This is a defeat for Ukraine and NATO as the sort of guiding force behind Ukraine. And the sooner we accept that and come to terms, then the better it will be. The better it will be in terms of the expenditure of Western resources, but also Ukrainian manpower. I mean, it's cynical at the moment, the way the West is continuing to go on. And some people are even congratulating the fact that actually not a single Western life has been lost. I don't think that's true. I think actually Western lives have been lost, but tiny in proportion to the 1.4 million or so Ukrainian lives that have been lost.
Yeah, it's pretty dark. They're just pawns in a big game. And unfortunately, it seems like Europe is still hell-bent on continuing this charade. As a final question for you, we talked earlier about the potential collapse of Ukrainian armed forces, and really, I think it's a shot in the dark. I don't think anyone knows or could guess, because some of the greatest minds we have, as you said, were predicting this was going to happen long ago. But if Donald Trump does what he has threatened to do, which he's threatened to do just about everything, good or bad, if he does, in fact, decide to walk away from this conflict and say, I don't want any part of it, it's not my war, can Europe, can the EU and the UK, can they provide Ukraine with the necessary weapons, ammunitions, tanks, infantry fighting, everything that they need for any meaningful period of time, do you think?
No. I mean, well, they can try, but the message is in the article I wrote on NATO. If NATO is unable to, with America on board, is unable to prevent the success of Russia, then the chances of the EU doing it are even smaller. The EU has the same industrial problems that America has, the same deindustrialization problems, and that has been accentuated by the use of boomerang sanctions, which have had much greater impact on the EU than they have had on Russia. So, we're seeing car factories shut down in Germany, for example, and the high energy prices over here is a really big issue. So the short answer is no. And if I were Donald Trump, I'd walk away without a moment's hesitation. I'd let the EU know that I'm doing it. I would also, I have no sticks to use to actually to impose conditions on Putin, but I have one or two carrots, and one of the big carrots would be to say that I will walk away from NATO as well, because I think that NATO is well past its sell-by date. If you look at, and I'm sad to say this, having served with NATO, but if you look at NATO's track record, the track record is the Kosovo campaign, and the irony about the Kosovo campaign is that the strategic logic or the legal logic that was used to intervene in Kosovo is exactly the same logic that Russia has used to intervene in the Donbass. So we can hardly say that the Russians are quite illegal going into the Donbass when we've done exactly the same thing in Kosovo. Afghanistan, we were there for 15 or so years and beaten by a ragtag bunch of brave Taliban, but with very little military capability. And now we've had a bloody nose, or the Ukrainian army, which is the biggest in NATO, bigger even than the American army, has been defeated by the Russians in the Ukrainian campaign. So no, there's no chance that the Europeans could prevail. But I think if I were in Donald Trump's situation, walking away from the campaign and with the carrot to Putin, he would be really interested in the thought of the Americans walking away from NATO, because he sees NATO as a significant challenge. The Russians have been talking about NATO expansion. In the famous Bill Burns telegram from 2008, "Yet means yet." In that telegram, it was explained by Bill Burns. He's not alone. There are lots of other people who have been equally prescient. In that famous telegram, he said that this was a neuralgic issue for all Russians, not just Putin. So to me, NATO has been adopting throughout its life a confrontational strategy that it actually described as collective security, but it was actually confrontational security. And we need to move to a cooperative security regime where actually we start to talk to each other again. And I think not a bad vehicle for that is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which Russia is a member. It's not doing perfectly, the OSCE, but it's doing a heck of a lot better than NATO.
Well, God willing, Trump does that, and sanity and logic prevail in Europe, in European capitals. I hope so. Steve Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today. Incredibly insightful. Where should people follow along with your work if they want to stay up to date, and where can they purchase your book?
I'm sad to say, Jackson, because I've been lazy, that my book's out of print at the moment, so I'm just started work on the second edition. But and I'll be starting up a Substack shortly. But the best place to follow me is with Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and I regularly support him on podcasts. And there's two or three of us in Britain actually going to start to run our own podcast. So for the moment, watch Daniel Davis Deep Dive and watch the podcast on there. We've probably done about 10 or so between the two of us. And don't know if you've come across him, but he's really, really good guy, Daniel Davis. Very, very well worth having here if you haven't interviewed him already.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I am familiar with him. So everyone be sure to check it out and update us when the second edition comes out. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jackson.